Alberta Infidelity, Iain Ireland and Robert Lees-Miller. I'm Fiona, I will be your chair. With me are Jacqueline, Ashvin, Romeo, and Jasmine. Christine will be your timer. Without any further ado, I call for the Prime Minister to open up this round of debate. Here, here.
I'll try to be as loud as I can, but I apologize if people are that. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you to Western for hosting an amazing weekend of debating. It's been a privilege to be here. George and I want to run a case today that we think is interesting and gets to the very core of human existence. We are going to, on our side of the House, oppose organized religion. We are going to argue that the world is a better place if people held their own beliefs and didn't tie those beliefs to the preachings of others or the beliefs of others. That every human individual should have their own moral reasoning and not tie that to something that is told to them. We think that's a better world. The kind of base analogy we would say is that people following the principles of Catholicism is good, the Catholic Church is bad. I think that's a fairly clear realm in which we want to do. We just have really one huge argument. That these religious institutions have pernicious effects both on individuals' belief structures and on the world in which we live. We are obviously going to break it up into a number of parts. So first of all, Madam Speaker, we believe on our side of the House that all human beings have a fundamentally equal ability to access moral concepts and decide for themselves what is right or wrong. Every individual has the ability to read the spiritual text of their choice and interpret it however they will. I think that every one of those... Is it clarification? No. That every one of those individuals' interpretations could be equally valid, and it is not the place of some religious institution to tell them what it means when every human being has the rational ability to decide for themselves what it ought to mean. I would think, Mr. Speaker, thank you, that everyone's morality ought to be seen as equal, and that doesn't happen in religious institutions where hierarchies are present. I'll talk more about that in a second. But secondly, Madam Speaker, under this, the structures of religion create figureheads who claim this authority and tell people how to live their lives. Madam Speaker, it is our suggestion that if any individual person put as much time into studying the teachings of the Bible, into trying to interpret what they thought Catholicism meant, they would have a morally equal claim to being a preacher of Catholicism than would the Pope. But Madam Speaker, the Catholic Church does not recognize that individual because he doesn't fit within the hierarchy that they have created. We think that's profoundly unjust when individuals' autonomy to make moral decisions is called into question. I also think the hierarchies create further problems that I'll address later. Secondly, Madam Speaker, how ought someone's individual spiritual beliefs be best actualized in the world? Madam Speaker, before I do that, go.
What about cases where religious doctrine demands that people come together and worship as a community in some sort of organized system?
I'm making an argument? I don't really understand where you're going. I guess those exist. Make an argument about it. So how these individuals are best able to actualize their beliefs. Because, Madam Speaker, it is an exceptionally rare case. We would argue outside proposition that it just doesn't exist, that individuals agree with every precept of the religion that they hold to themselves, that they try to adhere to. We think the fact that there's this inconsistency, the fact that there's this tension, poses significant harms to the individual in question. Their beliefs are as I said earlier, their beliefs are no morally less legitimate than the body who is telling them what to believe, so we think it's an entirely legitimate moral worldview. We think that individuals being forced to choose between their beliefs and the beliefs of the religious structure they try to adhere to is very problematic. One of two things happens. Either these individuals stifle their own beliefs and kind of say, whatever, I'm going to go with what the religious leader is telling me. I think at that point, Madam Speaker, their faith, their belief in the their belief in the structure is hugely undermined when they have to sacrifice their own personal morality for the sake of being accepted by that community. I think that's a problem. The second possibility is that they reject the structure itself. I think at that point, they have to reject the precepts that they themselves would have agreed with anyway, and I think that's a problem for them. If some opposition is going to say, well, people should just believe what they want to about religion, that is our case, I would advise them not to use that as an opposition line. But furthermore, Madam Speaker, I think if they reject the full structure of the religious organization because if they reject the full structure, that has an additional harm. In so doing, I think they sometimes will reject all codified moral structures when they wouldn't necessarily have wanted to do that. I think that's a problem as well. But point out, Madam Speaker, this is not merely academic philosophizing by George and I. There are many, many people within the Catholic Church who think that condom use is a perfectly moral thing, but who have to either subjugate that belief or decide that they're not going to adhere to the principles of the religion they choose to hold. I think that's problematic. They should not be coerced into that. Perhaps a more pernicious example, now thank you, are individuals who are ostracized from their communities because they refuse to wear the burqa because that doesn't fit with their ideology. I think that's a completely legitimate moral stance, and functionally, religious structures undermine their ability to make that moral choice. I think that's a problem. No, thank you. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, these conflicts are intensely personal and damaging when they cause immense self-doubt and self-loathing among these individuals. That someone in a position of religious authority is telling them, you are being sinful because of who you are. You are shameful because you are gay. I think that has massive harms to the individual in question. I don't think they should ever be subjected to that. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, and lastly under this, the individuals in question are far more likely to follow the precepts and tenets of that religion if they come to those beliefs themselves and hold them to be meaningful, no thank you, rather than having them dictated to them by a religious authority on high that has no more moral legitimacy than their own beliefs. Excuse me. Thirdly, we think that religious institutions foster divisions within humanity that would not otherwise exist. First of all, note they are necessarily exclusive. You either believe what they do or you don't, and they will not accept you if you don't believe what they do. That fosters division between people who would otherwise hold fairly similar moral precepts. No, Madam Speaker, that of the major religions, they all preach, at least in some ways, similar messages. Be kind to the poor, treat people as you would wish to be treated. Those are similar statements, but churches and religious institutions pose massive hurdles towards individuals accepting each other when they see the other side of Excuse me. Furthermore, the churches and religious institutions need to magnify those differences in order to justify their own existence. I think that's a problem. Furthermore, they have a strong incentive to not allow people to ask questions about their moral faith, because that would undermine their authority. Note, Madam Speaker, that we think those are questions that every individual ought to ask and ought to be entitled to ask and organize religious. Lastly, organized religious conflicts. Organized religious conflicts are massive. I'm out of time, so George is going to talk about this. Yes. Also, but I would point out that in religious conflicts, the belief the other side has to be saved leads to them being completely intractable in many circumstances, whereas other conflicts are not, for all those reasons we're trying to promote.
Prime Minister for his remarks, and I'll call forth the Leader of the Opposition.
Do you want these for your rebuttal? I have it. I just couldn't have one while I was.
If I'd known I would be here, I would have shaved this morning. All right. So, we see the case. This House would opposes, can't read my notes, organized religion. Thanks, guys. This is an awesome round. I'm really excited to debate this, actually. So our stance here on side opposition is that we are not going to deny that there are occasionally certain harms that come from certain forms of hierarchy within organized religion. We don't think it's debatable that there are some things that the Catholic Church does that are occasionally bad. But our stance is that the general precept of having an organized religion, of having some sort of formal organization with which religious people affiliate themselves and with which they feel a sense of identity, can be incredibly important for their religious development and can be tremendously beneficial for their feelings as individuals, and we support that on side opposition. So I have two major constructive ideas that I want to bring in, and I'm going to do some fairly thorough clash with what we talked about with the Prime Minister. The first thing I want to talk about is community. I'm going to talk about this in two ways. First, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes religious communities are part of religious doctrine. So if Stephen expects people to get up and say, and read the Bible and follow the teachings of the Bible and listen to what the Bible tells you to do, then one of those things is to get together with other Christians and celebrate together, to have some form of organization. So it's not possible to have religion separate from organization when the religion itself is telling you, to be good, you should go out, organize, set up this structure. Like, that's simply incoherent. The second important thing about community, which I think is even more important, is that community forms part of religious experience. So we think that one of the things that makes religion so appealing to people is a sense of belonging to a community, is the sense of belonging to a greater movement, having shared customs with people both in your own church community and around the world who belong to your broader church, under the larger umbrella organization, the Catholic Church, for example, or whatever. So we think that one of the things that brings people together is this feeling, look, right now we are sitting here saying the Latin Mass. Around the world there are other people who are allied with me, people who believe the same things, people I feel a kinship with, who are also reading the Latin Mass. This has been read for hundreds of years and it provides people with a sense of belonging. We think that's one of the really important things that religion gives people, the sense that, you know what, I belong to something greater than myself. And when you take the organization out, and you have a bunch of scattered individuals not coming together, not having a sense of community, then we think you lose something real about religion. You lose one of the important parts of what makes people seek religion in the first place. Like, I'm a culturally Presbyterian atheist, in that I went to school, or I went to church for many years, but don't actually believe in God. But I recognize that the community that is there is very important to the people who are part of it. That just the sense of coming together and having these common precepts, having these songs, having all of these customs that have been built up over the course of this organization gives people this important sense. So, what did Penner tell you? The first thing he talked about was that the Pope has a fundamentally equal ability to any individual who has put in the time to interpret religious doctrine. Sure. If you want to put in as much time as the Pope into reading the Bible and learning about religious doctrine, then more power to you. But we think that that's not something that we should expect from everybody who wants to participate in religion.
Is it not more fair to say that all human beings are at least as good an arbiter as another one about what is right and wrong, and should not let someone else tell them what their moral values should be?
Okay, so we think that it's entirely reasonable for people to seek guidance on moral matters. We think it's entirely reasonable for somebody to say, look, these are hard questions. What do other people think? Can we maybe find some way of selecting the people who'd be really good at telling us what's right, and then putting them in some elevated place where they can use their platform to tell us about this? We think that church leaders are selected on their ability and the time they put in to consider all these questions, to have answers to these questions. It's basic specialization of labor. The Pope is saving time for everybody else by concentrating on this himself. Okay, so the second thing we see is this idea that there are figureheads who tell people how to live their lives. And I think actually this gets into the second constructive idea that I want to bring in now, which is good hierarchies versus bad hierarchies. We think it's entirely possible that you have a very strict top-down hierarchy that tells you exactly what you must believe. And we think we've seen examples of this in some ways in the Catholic Church on some issues, and we've also seen how this drives people away from the church, how many people are finding other religions, finding different organizational structures that suit them better. There's sort of a competitive system here where the free market solves. What we see here is that there can be better structures, and we can even see these in some areas within the Catholic Church. There's a principle called subsidiarity, and what it means is that the Catholic Church pushes decisions down to the people it affects most. So a lot of decisions on individual levels are made at the parish level, or by the bishops in relative areas when there are things that concern them, and the really important religious questions are often pushed up the ladder. But they recognize that sometimes it's important to give power to people down the ladder. We think it's entirely possible to have a more open hierarchy, a place where people are actively encouraged to ask questions, to challenge concepts, raise these things, and then have the entire organization sort things out. It's not impossible to have an organization dedicated to searching after religious truth where we respect individuals' opinions more than the Catholic Church. We think that kind of organized religion is great. We hear this idea that there's this tension for individuals who choose between their own belief and what their religious leaders say. And we say that there's a third way out of this problem, which I've already identified. It's you go to a religious organization that does a better job of representing what you believe. We think there's a diversity of them out there, and the ones that are more right, resonate more with the moral principles that people inherently feel, are the ones that are going to get adherence. So we think that you don't necessarily, if there is a tension, that organization might be wrong, but it doesn't mean that every organized religion is wrong. So we hear this idea that this fosters divisions between people. You have all of these religions and they necessarily divide people. We don't think this is necessarily true. We see that, for example, Islam has the concept of peoples of the book, where they recognize Jews and Christians as being in some way affiliated with them, still seekers after truth, still like on the right track, just slightly different. Like there's not necessarily this case where all people outside your religion are seen as inherently completely wrong. They recognize, look, here are some things we hold in common. Let's reach out to them ecumenically and try to find common ground. We think organizations facilitate that. Organizations give you a leverage to have these broader works, and for those reasons, we're very proud to support organizations.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks. I now call forth the who deserve the credit.
I don't need it. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm going to refute and then rebuild, but first I wanted to spend some time just clarifying where I actually just I want to talk briefly about what exactly our contention is with regards to organization, because I think a lot of opposition in this case, and this is the point. We don't have a problem with individuals having a religious identity that exists in sort of dialogue with other individuals, with asking guidance, with talking about what they believe, and having some things oftentimes in common. What we have a problem with, is institutions that structure people's belief systems that require them that they adhere to certain individual things along with other things to abide by those beliefs. So that you can only be a Catholic if you have all of these beliefs together. So that you can only be a Muslim if you have all of these beliefs together. And if you reject any of them, you reject them all. And they instruct you that you ought to believe these no matter what. That is what we have a problem with. That is what we can consider organizational, and that is what we're opposing today. So what does side opposition talk about? First of all, communities. They say, first of all, some religions require organization without which they cannot believe. Such that there are some belief systems that an individual may hold that they cannot hold without having organizational content. So first of all, our argument on opposition is that those belief systems are bad. If you can divorce the part that are organizational from the rest, the world is a better place. But I further want to clarify the notion of community that they use with the notion of organization that we're opposing. I don't have a problem with people praying together. I don't have a problem with communities which share belief systems. I have a problem when they become hierarchical. I have a problem when they become dictatorial towards each other. I have a problem when they become exclusionary to other people's belief systems. There's nothing wrong with having a community based around ideas. There are things wrong when they become instructive towards what you should hold to be in those communities. That's what we have a problem with on side government. The second thing he talks about under this is how communities give identity and belonging. In essence, they give you a place with which you can feel some commonality towards other individuals around you. Without the organizational structure, you couldn't be a Catholic because Catholic requires this organizational structure. And perhaps being a Catholic gives some meaning to who you are. I concede that it does give you an identity. The problem Henry and I have, as he explained in his last argument, is that these identities that they engender are functionally and fundamentally exclusionary. That it isn't encompassing, it doesn't spread you open and build relationships with all the people in the world. That what it mostly does is exclude you from other people in the world. They say that my family, the people I care about, the people I want to work for and give charity towards, are Catholics. My family, the people I care about, the people I feel affinity towards, the people I put more value in, are Muslims. And we think when you build these identities, they're fundamentally exclusionary to the broader sense, the broader identity that we think we all hold, the broadest identity that can give us all value. That it's a human identity, Mr. Speaker, that we're all part of the largest possible family, and that all these people can give you a sense of identity, sense of purpose. Devote yourself to the church of humanity if you want to, Mr. Speaker. If you want to access that identity that gives you purpose in life, that is what we think you should most ultimately value. The last thing they talk about is that there are better structures that, broadly speaking, you can access in society, that these things, like functionally, the backup of the Catholic Church isn't necessary to an organized organizational structure. I presume that they're talking about things about how they give some sort of discretionary things to subsidiary churches, as we discussed, which is just an argument that highlights the positions that we're trying to take, Mr. Speaker. As Madam Madam Speaker. And so the further you go down the line of this devolving power, the less organizational religion becomes. Such that you recognize the fact that people in certain situations always, or actually do always have a better read on what is true, given AIDS in Africa perhaps, than the Pope does. So you give them sort of the ability to decide for themselves what is the course of action in that circumstance. The further organized religions move towards this position that abolitionists are articulating, the better they'll be, because they're coming towards side government. So what does Penner talk about? A lot, and I think little bit is refuted. The first thing he talks about is how all humans have an equal access to right. What we hold, Madam Speaker, is there are certain moral values that exist in the world. They are objectively true. I do not think the Pope or any individual imam has a better idea of how to get to that truth than Penner or I does. And we think any system that tells you that you cannot access those things is fundamentally limiting your ability as a human being to make moral.
We also hold, Madam Speaker, that it's necessary to conception of a human being that they be able to make moral decisions, to act in a moral sense, and to analyze things critically. When you create systems that turn people into less than moral agents, than people who only act but do not think, I think you debase them and you turn them into less than human beings. That's a problem. I'll take it.
But the danger here is that Scripture is a metaphor, and it's hard to put all of the metaphors into the right context if you haven't gone through all of that study. And it's easy to misinterpret them, and that's the problem.
I'll choose a different metaphor for my Scripture, I guess. So, the last thing I want to talk about under this is that people are less likely to follow these beliefs and values, indeed these scriptural metaphors, if they themselves don't come to it. So sure, if the Scripture is only accessible through this metaphor, that's a problem because, Madam Speaker, it's likely not to mean much to me because it didn't evolve out of my own experiences, and maybe it's not even written in my own language. In that circumstance, I think people feel distance from the values that we think are most important to them, give them the most meaning, that makes them more solid. What do we hear from opposition with regards to this? That people can seek guidance, and that's an okay thing. So first of all, guidance doesn't need to be formalized or structured. I can ask you about your beliefs and take learning from it without it needing to be hierarchical. But second of all, and more important, I think it's important to recognize that in seeking guidance from organizational religious structures, they require them to access all of their knowledge, to access any of it, in order to be part of it. Such that it becomes a lesson in learning to be a Catholic rather than learning just to be charitable. And I think that's guidance that is actually fundamentally erosive to your religious beliefs rather than substantiated. The second thing we talk about is how individuals can actualize their beliefs better, that they're more important to them in the circumstance where they come to them naturally. We contend, Madam Speaker, that it's the case for everyone in the world that there are some senses in which their own personal beliefs come into tension with the Scripture as is the case. We hear that people tend to choose the religions that make most sense to them. So first of all, there are barriers to leaving religions because of the religious identities they themselves talk about. If your family is coercing you into being a Catholic or being a Muslim, I don't think you actually are able to access different belief systems that make more sense to you. But second of all, you're taught within these belief systems not to question them in the first place, such that you aren't thinking critically about what does make sense to you, and therefore you are imprisoned within those religions. So that means that religious value, the belief system that you would have, will always be less meaningful, less enlightening to you as a person, because it didn't come from what you believe, they were taught to you. We say that people also may abandon these things entirely, and this also leads to loathing and self-doubt. None of these harms were even mentioned in Iain's speech. Last thing we talked about religious divisions, this was also mostly not addressed. The only thing to say is, Islam recognizes some sort of religious divisions. Parts of Islam do, other parts don't. The parts of Islam that are at least organized are the ones that have this problem with beliefs. We think that this necessarily leads to religious tension and religious conflict, and necessarily leads to people dying in the streets all over the world, and that is a world that is worse off because of it. Madam Speaker, if you value beliefs, you value them because they hold true for you, and organized religion will always distance you from that fundamental truth. Thank you.
As I heard the Minister of the Crown for his remarks, I now call for the member of opposition.
So, what Hart came up here and tried to argue, or wanted to argue today, was that this House believes that religious literalism is bad. Unfortunately, that's a truth. So they tried to move it to something else and say that organized religion is bad. But realistically, there is nothing harmful and inherently evil about the organization of religion. The only time when religion becomes dangerous is when people take a literal interpretation of it. And you can do that regardless of whether you're in an organized culture or not. Realistically, the harm that they've identified is religious literalism, not religious organization, and we can get into why. But you can look at this because of the way that Trotter framed this idea that you're required to adhere to your religion to stay within it. But that's not true. You can be a Catholic if you follow Christ. That is the true criteria. Part of that is going to church and talking to your priest. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow everything that your priest says. The organization that exists and says that there's a hierarchy of understanding of what it means to be a Catholic does not mean that you need to follow the hierarchy absolutely. Because the only absolute authority that that person could possibly derive is that they derive that absolute authority from an absolute understanding of the scripture. But that's not true. And that's the problem. It's when people use the organization of religion to enforce an absolutist idea that it becomes a problem. Until they use organization to enforce absolutism, they are not causing a harm. All that they are doing is using the hierarchy and specialization of their talents and their understanding of the very difficult questions, what it means to be a Catholic, or anyone else of any other religion, to better explain that to you and to help you on your guide and help you on your path to faith and enlightenment. Now, it's the exact same thing with Islam as well. This isn't exclusive to Catholicism, it's the same for any organized religion. They also talk about this idea that, organized religious identities are always exclusionary. But then you can actually look to their example of Catholicism. Like Christ said, turn the other cheek. Moses said, love thy neighbor. Nowhere in there is it only turn the other cheek to other Catholics, or only love thy neighborhood Catholics. It is all about following an example of positive enlightenment and saying, these are the messages, these are the ideas that my faith espouses, that I learned through my priest, that are reinforced through the priesthood, and that are reinforced and created by these very strong organizational hierarchies that understand the philosophy and can make that philosophy accessible to me without me being a theology.
Surely Catholicism and Protestantism agrees with almost everything. It's the small differences those respective churches focused on to fuel the wars and to fuel the power of the two churches.
Yeah, and part of that was that the Protestants decided on a literal interpretation of the Bible rather than not. Or maybe I got the wrong side of it, or something. But a large part of the religious conflicts come from the literalism, not the organization. And you can have different organizations of churches that get along. Like you can look at all the Alliance and United Methodist and all these other churches that exist and coincide peacefully. The fact that they are organized and have strict hierarchies doesn't mean that they attack each other. It's only when they use literalist interpretations of their scriptures to attack each other that the organizations even become a problem. And you as an individual can pick up the Bible and read a literalist interpretation and cause all of the harms that government is talking about, regardless of the fact that you're disorganized. All of the harms they've identified are only true when you take an absolutist stance, which is not inherent to an organized religion, and is not necessarily even bred by an organized religion. So they also talked about this idea that devolving control means that we're agreeing with their point. But we're not being forced to argue here that we must enforce a strict and perfect organization of hierarchy. It's legitimate to say that you can be organized without being a absolutist organization. That's an entirely false dichotomy. They also talked about this idea that there's a better way to truth, and it's through your self-exploration. But when all of your scripture is a metaphor, when everything that you read is something that is supposed to tell you a story and give you an understanding, and you can't possibly absorb all of that information, you can't possibly absorb all of that huge breadth of human experience that has gone into those metaphors and gone into the explanation of those metaphors without accessing them through someone who's been in a real study of it, who knows that religion inside and out, who is willing and able to talk to you about the difficult questions that you can't quite answer on your own. They also said, and we also assert that if your religion really is nasty to you, you can choose a different one. And they said that there are barriers to exit from organizations. But not if your organization is not absolutist. This is not something that is inherent to the organization. If you're not in a church that is going to stone you to death for leaving them because they have a literalist and absolutist interpretation of their holy scripture, then you can leave, and there is no barrier. And frankly, that's fine. And people can make their own choices and choose guidance from who they choose. But we would say that the guidance should be there, and they should be able to organize to get that guidance.
It isn't just in churches that require that you stone people. Did you get the strong sorts of community that you guys are talking about that would force someone to stay within their religion? Not just crazies do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but the only time when that's a problem is when it's the crazies doing it. If you have someone who doesn't literally read, you must stone apostates to death, and they don't take that as a literal commandment, but rather as an idea that we shouldn't be like apostates, that we should be someone who does stay with the faith, because it's the best way to get enlightenment. Unless you read that in an absolute context, it doesn't matter. If you choose to follow the rational path of religion and read it as a metaphor, read it as a story, you can realize that it's a bad idea to leave the religion because that means you're not a part of the faith anymore and you're losing your connection with God, which is pretty obvious. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to kill someone who doesn't. Because even though it's written that way, it doesn't mean that you need to take that as a written, set-in-stone commandment. They also talk about how learning to be charitable is the thing that you should be doing. But when you're learning to be charitable by being inspired by learning to be a Catholic or learning to be an anything, we think that that is the benefit that you gain from the religion. By learning to be a part of that community and learning your place within that hierarchy and within that structure, you gain the inspiration that makes you want to be charitable. You gain the inspiration to say that I want to be a better person because I am motivated by my faith, that someone is explaining to me and allowing me to learn in a way that I wouldn't be able to by just simply reading the text as it stands. So what we want to stand on today is that the entire point of a priesthood and the entire point of an organization is to provide guidance. That we would say that when it becomes absolutist, when it becomes literalist, that is a problem. But that is not a problem inherent to the organization. That is not a problem inherent to structure. And so if they want to argue against all of the harms of extremist religions, they should say that we oppose extremist religions. Not that we should oppose the average person who likes to go to church, who likes to be able to have someone give him guidance, and have someone who he recognizes is someone who's more advanced in the faith than he is, that can help him answer those difficult questions that he can't answer on his own. We don't think we should be discriminating against that person who's exploring their faith as part of an organization, especially when it is demanded by their faith that they do so.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for his remarks. I now call for the leader of the opposition summary.
So my iPod managed to die during Trotter's speech. I have two broad areas where I want to look at this case. The first thing I want to answer is the question that Trotter clarified as being that the main thing you want to talk about in this case during the speech: is it ever legitimate for an authority to establish absolute dogma? The second thing I want to look at is sort of the broad set of harms they've identified, and I think I'll show you how they're less relevant once we've answered the first question. So, the basic problem with absolute dogma comes when the top-down dogma that is being absolutely enforced is wrong. Penner and Trotter have come here, and they've told you that there is some sort of objective moral truth that we can all access equally. There's some sort of basic set of moral principles that is correct. So the problem that arises with organized religion is when the people at the top have the moral principles wrong. We think it's important then to recognize that there is nothing inherently wrong with organized religion. The problem is that you don't have the people at the top giving the right answers downwards. If you can set up a hierarchical dogmatic structure, but the correct principles are being imposed from the top, then we think that's great. Then you have a system where you have people you trust and respect who are telling you, look, we've had a bunch of people sit down, they've read this text that we all recognize as a source of truth. They've selected the people amongst them who are best at identifying the real answers in it. And those people have selected somebody else who's really good at it, and that guy will give us some answers, and then you end up with good answers flowing down from the top. Now, how do we achieve this idealistic system? We think that the best way to do it is what we see with organized religions today, where we have many organized religions with competing hierarchies, where people can switch from religion to religion to find the one that best represents their own inherent moral feelings. And once they do that, once these people have shifted to represent their moral feelings at whatever church, then market solves, the best church is the one where you have a bunch of people. So let's look then at what the harms are that they've identified. So broadly they fall into categories like it's really hard to switch from one church to another. There's this sense of loathing and self-doubt when you're in tension with the basic moral principles established by your church. We think that these are a sign, the problems here are that you're not partaking in the good things about religion. So when it's hard for you to switch, when you feel ostracized from your community, it's not bad, it's bad because the alternative is so good. It's bad because being part of a religion, feeling that sense of belonging, is so beneficial, and when you lose that, you're so sad. So organized religion provides us with a bunch of really great things.
And then when you don't have those things available to you, that's a problem. But that's an argument for organized religions that work, organized religions that actually have these structures, not an argument for getting rid of organized religion altogether. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Madam Speaker, two issues. First of all, faith and morality. Secondly, religion. We believe outside government the two are actually different. We think that's important. First, faith and morality. Side opposition tells you that maybe part of your faith is coming together with others and sharing your belief system. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. It's where it becomes hierarchical that it is a problem. I'll directly address the hierarchy later. But I would secondly point out on this morality thing, that we argue that no individual has greater access to the correct morality than any other. The response we get from side opposition is, well, people who study know these things. But, Madam Speaker, I would ask you, if someone else studied just as much, devoted their life to studying the Bible, would their moral beliefs be any less valid than the Pope's? And if not, why does the Pope have 1 billion followers and that person doesn't? I think that is actually immoral, because both of those moral beliefs should be fundamentally equal, but because of the hierarchical structures of religion, they functionally aren't. Then they say, look, people just choose these leaders. This is absurd. People in organized religion do not actively choose the leaders. Ordinary Catholics don't get a vote on the Pope. This is just ludicrous. The second issue is around that of religion. We get a number of very silly claims from opposition. They say religions encourage you to question the dogma. So, Madam Speaker, was Luther embraced and debated, or was he excommunicated and shunned? True, that is not the case. We also hear, look, people can switch religions, and so, literally the term he uses is market solves. Madam Speaker, changing your moral precepts, adopting a different moral code, we are going to argue, does not make you a less moral person. It does not make you an evil person. It does not make you less worthy of a happy and fulfilling life. It does not make you any less worthy of going to heaven. But, Madam Speaker, the institutions and hierarchies they are defending say that it does. They are saying that individual is now less moral because of the decision they've made, because the hierarchy in the religious organization is saying that. We absolutely reject that premise. The last thing we get, the most important thing to come out of Robbie's speech is, look, it's not institutions that are bad, it's a literal interpretation. Madam Speaker, if I take a literal interpretation and think that I have some kind of extremism about my religion, I am one person. If a person at the top of a religious organization takes a position that is extreme and that would call for a holy war, they have 1 billion followers around the world. The existence of hierarchies makes the risk of literal interpretation causing conflicts. This isn't just academic. Literally, this has been the cause of every holy war ever, and that encompasses a great deal of the conflicts this planet has seen. If people could not rally the followers to go and defeat the infidels and save their souls,